Alrighty, well, welcome, folks. This is a case study on a clinical trials company. And the reason I selected this case study is a lot of times when we think about scaling Scrum, we're talking about hundreds of people. And what I liked about this particular client and this particular case study is it really just consisted of 5 teams. And so really determining what is that kind of minimal viable scaling needed and from a framework perspective so they could get the benefits of Scrum at scale without too much overhead to best meet their needs. And so let's kind of dive in here. Company P is the company that we're going to reference, and it's basically a global healthcare company. And this is basically a statement from their website. But what we were focusing on in this case study was a specific product of theirs, which is their clinical trial management platform. And this was key for them because this is one of their larger revenue generating applications and was really critical to really take clinical trials through the various phases, starting at phase 0 onwards. And so what was the context here? Well, they were trying to come out, and this is probably about 4 years old. 2016 is when this occurred, between 2016 2017, where they wanted to basically upgrade or modernize their clinical trial platform. And they were going through their 3.0 release. And so if we take a look at some of the data points here, they had originally envisioned this as taking hopefully relatively 18 months, maybe 24 months on the outset, and really going through 5 distinct phases. Unfortunately, when they went through their first 2 phases, they were following very much a waterfall approach. There was a little bit of experimentation with Scrum, but it wasn't fully implemented throughout all the folks involved in this particular application. And we're talking a small group, probably about 60 people or so. But some of the challenges that they had were the average lead time from requirements to actually getting in the production and code for those first 2 phases was already taking well over 12 months. So they'd already consumed 2/3 of their time frame. The other thing that was unfortunate was they had adopted a lot of the modules that they were utilizing from a third party. And those third-party modules were very unstable once they actually got into the testing phase of this waterfall process. So I was brought in as a coach and was working part-time with this group over a 6-month period. And what this case study will do is kind of walk through what are those basic things that we put into place to really help them begin to move the needle as they got into their phase 3 and 4 movement of the 3.0 application to production. So if we take a look here, some of their key challenges is they really needed to accelerate the delivery and quality in the remaining 3 phases. Like I said, they'd already consumed about 2/3 of their 18-month period. And they did get an extra, 12 months from leadership. So really going from really 12 months to 24 months in total. But they needed to actually finish 3 phases within the same time frame it had taken them to complete 2. So we started to look at some things like, okay, we got to get better about improving how we're planning our releases and balancing scope with the capacity of the teams. So really going toward more of a push, or rather a pull model from a push model. The other thing is realizing that everything in their requirements can't get done. So what are truly those must-haves that really create a minimal viable product for that version 3.0 phase 3 release? And then also too, we have some teams sort of attempting Scrum, but how do we begin to level set and create a foundational understanding across all 5 teams in terms of understanding what Agile is and what is that Scrum framework? And then really working with the product owners and Scrum Master for these 5 teams and helping them mature and how they can effectively play those roles. And then working with not only the teams, but leadership and improving planning and collaboration through basically 5 globally distributed teams. And so some of the other things we touched on in terms of challenges is that they had acquired a solution that really wasn't fully baked. And so they actually ended up having to do a lot of the testing that should have been done by this third party, and that slowed things down. Furthermore, we had 5 teams that really weren't working in cadence across the United States, Ukraine, the Netherlands, and then 2 locations in India. And there were a lot of extraneous features in the application. So we had to figure out what do we need to keep and what do we need to jettison. And regardless how agile we got the 5 teams working on this particular product, we still had heavy reliance on reporting, which operated in a traditional waterfall approach. The other thing is this organization was fairly mature with automation, but it tended to lag way behind in terms of when things actually got automated. So could we move and accelerate that to where could we get no more than maybe 1 sprint behind from an automated regression perspective? And the final thing here was not only were we working with unstable modules to kind of create this next gen, but we were also taking the interface that wrapped everything, which was Salesforce, and moving from its older interface to its Lightning interface and dealing with those challenges. So this gives you a visualization of basically working across multiple time zones and trying to keep 5 teams synchronized. And so what was the approach? Well, let's go ahead and revisit the vision for the 3.0 product. I'm always a big fan of, no matter where a team or organization is, what is it we're trying to create, for whom and why? Making sure that not only are the teams aligned, but is leadership aligned? And then working with leadership, and we start to look at this, what they use the term is basically modules. Each module needed to do N number of things. And so we need to determine, okay, what is that macro backlog, maybe that program backlog? Let's call them epics. And really getting good about what are the must-haves that need to be there in the phase 3 for this next round. We're going to call that our minimal viable product, because pretty much phase 1 and 2 just turned out to be almost throwaway. And then once we actually define our minimal viable product, what's going to come after that? We could use the term minimal viable increment. What are those must-haves in phase 4 and phase 5, knowing that those other phases are kind of notional or forecasted, and really trying to commit what's going to be there for phase 3. And then what we needed to do too is kind of figure out, okay, we've got 5 teams. What's the simplest scaling framework that we could basically inject using Scrum? So that way we could keep 5 teams kind of marching together toward realizing the vision of the 3.0 product. And so what we started, once we did those items, where we went next is really level setting the teams with Agile and Scrum through facilitated training that we basically had to spread across multiple time zones. And so most of the events that were Scrum related, training, workshops, always took place usually between 8 a.m. and 12 p.m., if not a little bit earlier, to accommodate folks in Europe as well as those folks in India, so we could actually get everyone together. Improve role clarity. So Scrum Masters understood their role, product owners understood their role, and we had a chief product owner, and they used the term product manager, really understanding what their responsibility was. And they proved to actually be a critical linchpin, because they were the ones making the hard choices as to which epics associated with the modules needed to be done in what order, and then communicating and sharing that information to the 5 teams. And then what we did is we established a simplified release planning, where over the period of 3 half days, we could get all 5 of these Scrum teams basically aligned in terms of what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve for this phase, what are the epic priorities, what are the dependencies across the teams, how can we sequence the work so we can address those dependencies, and what are those risks that are kind of bubbling up at that program layer that we need to be cognizant of. And then we established a scaled daily Scrum to keep everybody in sync as we went forward across 5 teams, 5 time zones, and then to basically make sure, okay, are we actually moving toward the objectives of this particular phase of this particular release? And so, as we went forward, some of the recommendations that we put in place is really getting good about module and module requirements prioritization. What modules do we attack in what order? It could be based on business priority, coupled with how destabilizes the module and how much refactoring is going to be needed. And also, too, decomposing each module into smaller stories to where we could determine maybe we don't need to get all of module A, B, and C done in this phase. What are the most important stories for each of those modules? And we can push the lower priority stories into a subsequent phase. Getting Scrum Masters to approve any additions. And the reason the Scrum Masters were involved in this is that they were really good. They had a lot of subject matter expertise that complemented the product owners. They really understood the capacity of the teams and when to push back. The other thing too was solutioning, which was their term for backlog refinement, really coming up with a good definition of ready and reviewing stories to make sure as we come together in a quote unquote solutioning session, i.e. refinement, what stories are actually ready to be pulled into the next sprint and which ones need to be deferred because we need greater clarity. The other thing too is we need to basically kind of herd the cats and make sure that all 5 of these teams were following the same sprint cadence. It was one thing to do release planning together, but we needed to have our sprints start and end on the same days. So that way we could have individual team plannings, and demos, retros, but also too, at the end of every 2 weeks, we could have basically a macro demo of how well the solution was becoming integrated, is also too a retro in terms of how are we doing as a collection of teams going forward. We established, they use the term entrance and exit criteria, but these could be translated easily to definition of ready, definition of done. Since we're working across multiple teams, we need to have a common core definition across both of these, as well as what are those team specific. Since these folks were new to Agile, they found task creation and tracking was very helpful to them in order of defining the scope and actually tracking where they are each day. And over time, some of the teams decided that activity was no longer needed because they got the rhythm. And one of the things that we wanted to do was a commit versus complete metric to really say, hey, if we're committing to these number of story points, let's commit to getting those to done. So can we move that percentage as close to 100% commit versus complete sprint by sprint? So some of the things that once we got out of phase 3, which is really our introduction to Scrum and starting to really learn and mature, what we noticed was a dramatic increase in the number of requirements. And when I use the term requirements here, think epics, because these were coarse grained things that had to get broken down into smaller chunks. So at the end of 12 months, they had finished 18 requirements, i.e. epics, for both phases 1 and 2. Well, within a 6-month period, actually shorter than that, it was probably a little over 4, they were able to basically increase that completion rate by 300%, just by how we started to work in this new way and getting used to that. The other thing that was a bit dramatic is every team experienced, after their 3rd sprint, a stabilization in velocity. What you'll see here in the bottom 3, there's a kind of eye charts, but the idea is that over time, 3 of the teams that remained together in phase 3 had an upward trend. 2 of the teams that started to trend off, the reason for that was basically they were actually no longer needed for phase 4 and they focused on other work. And that's why you see that natural taper there. But on average, the collective velocity was trending better and better as we got to the end of the phase. So observations, well, what worked well? End user feedback. In the past, we were possibly meeting with end users every 6 months, at the earliest every 3 months. Here, not only did we actually have the product owners as well as the product manager, i.e. the chief product owner, in the demos and giving feedback every 2 weeks, if not every couple of days. But we actually had direct stakeholder feedback with end users, what were called basically customer rooms, where we would actually be able to demo to folks actually using the software and getting those occurring on a monthly basis. We had BAs pairing with the product owners to help decompose requirements. We were very much data-driven and using Microsoft Team Foundation Server and how are we actually tracking toward each of the modules. We addressed technical debt as part of our backlog in terms of if we have instability in that third-party module, what are we doing to actually refactor that so it's more maintainable? We were using a Scrum of Scrums to look at a holistic view of where were we at a program level across the different teams, as well as dependencies outside of the team. And we actually had what we call a program management team, which would parallel with an EAT that was put in place to not only support the teams, but anytime we encountered an impediment that could not be resolved by any one team, it would immediately get escalated to this EAT or program management team to get resolved. And then the team used a very repetitive checklist as we got better about deploying software and getting ready for these conference room pilots. So that way everything followed a good quality criteria. And that was baked into the definition of done. The other thing that we learned too is we did have a little bit of a lag time for our team members in India, where subject matter expertise was either in Europe or the United States. So we started to grow that knowledge within the teams in India. So they became less reliant on someone in Europe or the United States, thus reducing lag in terms of getting information they needed. Some additional lessons learned: establish a cross-functional team in each geographic area, define a common approach for metrics, establish that extend release planning over multiple days instead of trying to keep some people working beyond their time, reset leadership's expectations on what was feasible based on capacity, and really getting good as using Moscow. What are the must-haves? And we increased our feedback cycles. So overall, that kind of sums up the case study. How do we kind of minimally scale Agile across 5 teams? Thank you.